Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. This was the phrase popularized by Cato the Elder in his speeches to the Senate, and he would end every speech with this regardless of how relevant it was.
And why did he do this? That's precisely the question I want to answer in today's Travels with an Archaeologist, where we go to Carthage.
Now what you see behind me are just some of the ancient ruins of Carthage, and I say some because Carthage, guys, was a massive city. Even by today's standards, it was massive and sprawled out and populated. So of course the ruins are shattered and scattered across a lot of modern western Tunis. That being said, most of what you can find is in Sidi Bou Said, and what I'm going to show you is also in Sidi Bou Said. Now for that reason, today's video is going to be a long one. There's a lot to see and say, but hopefully I can cover most of it in most of its context. So that means that in my usual pattern of a whirlwind tour, we're going to start at Carthage's beginning, its founding, as my past self is about to explain. Now the story of Carthage's founding is an odd one, for the fact that it was done by a woman. That wasn't really common in ancient mythology. Now her name was Dido, or as the Tunisians would call her, Elisa, and she was from the city of Tyre, which is in Lebanon. The Tunisians still consider Elisa to be an important national figure, going so far as to put her on their coinage. As to her origins in Lebanon, this made her a Phoenician, and thus made Carthage a Phoenician city. We don't really have time to get into proper Phoenician history, so for now let's just say they were supreme sailors and merchants of the ancient Mediterranean. As to Elisa, she was once the princess of Tyre, and married to the city's high priest. However, following the death of her husband at the hands of her brothers sometime around 814 BCE, Elisa gathered up some supporters and fled the city. Now after Queen Elisa fled into exile, she arrived at this harbor right here. And it said that the locals weren't too happy with their arrival. So in order to dick with her or get her to leave or make a joke of it, they gave her the hide of an ox and told her you can have as much land as you can fit with this hide. So what did she do? But she took it apart into one thin strand and twisted it all around this hill right here. And that is the story of Carthage's founding. Or at least that's what the poets would have you believe. The fact is there are no historical records of Elisa, and even this account is a romanticized Roman poem, not from the Carthaginians themselves. It's worth noting that the Phoenicians built a lot of colonies in the 8th and 9th centuries BCE, and the historical Elisa may have even been sent by her brother to rule this new colony rather than come in exile. Now whether or not the story of Elisa is true, and there's no real reason to believe it isn't, even if it is a little bit exaggerated, it doesn't really matter. Because Carthage, given its geographical location, was always going to be a major trade center. All you need to do is look at a map to see that. Carthage lies in a big natural harbor in the geographic center of the Mediterranean. It could act as a hub to cut off the Greeks from this way, and a jumping off point to establish colonies westwards in Spain and Morocco, and it was Phoenician presence in the western Mediterranean that prevented the Greeks from westward expansion and confined them to the eastern world. Yep, from Cartagena to Spain and even from as far away as Lebanon, people would come here to trade and sell their merchandise. Phoenicians were quite rich, too. Not only did they trade the goods of others, they produced quite a bit of wealth all on their own. Now one of the things Phoenicians were known for, and by extension Carthaginians, was their use of the purple dye. And purple was of course a very imperial color. Only emperors wore it. And it was produced probably in this artisan quarter. And this is a Roman era artisan quarter. This dye was produced from seashells, and the Phoenicians kept the secret of how to make it to themselves, meaning not only was it prestigious, it was also monopolized, and only the very rich could afford it. Phoenicians became synonymous with the color purple, and this hasn't gone away. Even today, purple holds some odd political significance in Tunisia. Some dictators have used it to increase their power, others have used it as a rejection of power. And you can see, if you've been noticing this on my wrist, that's actually the hotel band they give me to ensure I can get back. So we're still using purple, and today it's a big theme across Tunisia, and all because of this Phoenician purple dye. Carthage's wealth only increased through the Iron Age. As the Assyrians, Persians, and Greeks took over the Phoenician heartland in Lebanon, this left Carthage as the major Phoenician center. As a result, the 5th and 4th centuries BCE saw Carthage enter a golden age, becoming the primary power in the Mediterranean just as the Roman Republic was expanding. Going to Sicily for a moment, by 264 BCE, Sicily was split between the Greek kingdom of Syracuse, which was a Roman ally, and the Carthaginians. It was inevitable that conflict would arise as both sides jockeyed for position. Ultimately, the First Punic War broke out, during which Rome attained victory. But Carthage wasn't finished. The general of the First Punic War was named Hamilcar, and following his defeat he went to the Carthaginian colonies in Spain with his 3 sons. The eldest, Hannibal Barca, is undoubtedly the most famous ancient resident of Carthage. Beginning in 218 BCE, Hannibal gathered a large army, including elephants, and set out to avenge Carthage's loss. Despite the Carthaginians having a superior navy, Hannibal opted for the surprise attack, and he sure did surprise them. Hannibal crossed the Alps with his elephants into northern Italy and encouraged the Gallic people in the region to join him in his fight against Rome, who had only conquered them a couple of decades earlier. Hannibal was wildly successful in fighting the Romans, handing them a truly devastating defeat at Cannae. It was such a complete defeat that it would stick in Roman memory for 500 years and is still considered a turning point for the Roman military. Following this defeat, they were forced into a lot of reform and became more what we would consider to be the Imperial Roman army. And they had a really hard time counterattacking too, as Hannibal's younger brothers continued to successfully defend Carthaginian lands in Spain and even sail reinforcements over through to Sicily and Italy. However, Hannibal ultimately did lose thanks to the actions of Scipio Africanus after a bloody 20-year-long war which saw Rome nearly wiped out. Many times in history, we see people change the world through their actions. Hannibal is one of the few who changed it through inaction. He did not march on Rome for reasons that are still hotly debated by historians, and ultimately the Romans won the war of attrition. Hannibal was defeated at the Battle of Zama. Following the defeat, Carthage lost all of its territory outside of Tunisia and had severe restrictions imposed on its navy and trade. But it was not the end. Carthage was still strong and the city was still alive. And it was this intact city, this specter of a mighty rival that had brought Rome to its knees, that struck such fear into Cato the Elder. Now, Cato believed in order to preserve the strength of Rome, Carthage would have to be destroyed. This was not actually an unpopular opinion in the eyes of most Romans. However, Cato would never live to see his vision come to pass. He died in 149 BC, just before the Third Punic War broke out. And break out it did. The Romans declared war on Carthage on a rather flimsy pretense in 149 BCE, and this time put an end to the city for good. And although it looks like this was the case of a now large and secure empire picking off the carcass of their rival, it wasn't as simple as it might seem. Now you can see here some of the original remains of the original Carthaginian wall. And look at how thick that was. And it was surrounded by a moat as well. And keep in mind, this went out for 3 layers. There were 3 of these sorts of walls the Romans had to get over to sack Carthage. Even in its dying days, it was a nearly impossible task. That's also not counting the fortified ports, and although the Carthaginian navy was limited, it was enough to defend itself. The Third Punic War lasted for 3 years, and the city was destroyed in 146. The Romans claimed to have dismantled every brick and salted the earth. Now, the destruction of Carthage wasn't really as bad as a lot of the chronicles like to say. In fact, a lot of the city did survive, but everything you see behind me is almost certainly a Roman or later reconstruction. The Romans did a number on it after 146 BC. Now, what does survive of the old Phoenician city survives behind me, and as you can see, it had to be excavated. It's not quite as impressive as the Roman ruins, is it? Yet nevertheless, these are the sort of houses that these early Carthaginian settlers would have lived in, and probably what they were still living in when Rome came to burn them all down. Despite this burning, a lot of Phoenicians and Berbers stayed behind and the territory was absorbed into the Roman Empire. Eventually Carthage was re-established, and who can blame them? Look at this port. It's big, it's wide, it's natural, and that's pretty lacking in North Africa. Yup, the Romans found just as much strategic use out of Carthage's position as the Phoenicians had. These other stretches of coast just didn't do it. And under Rome, a new phase of construction began, and it's this city which is what survives to be seen. Mostly. The Villa of the Aviary is one of the best preserved places in Carthage. It's unclear who it belonged to, but they were undoubtedly very wealthy. Villas of this size are usually found in the countryside, but this one is in the middle of the city. But Carthage was a rich city. All of this belonged to one family, a testament to the decadence of the Roman elite, and we can see just how wide the entrance hall was, along with rich mosaics and a splendid view. It even had its own vineyard. Now this here used to be a wine press. You don't believe me? Well, I mean, it doesn't look like much anymore. She got to picture it a bit more. So you can see how the walls have collapsed on it. You would have put the grapes in here, or the olives, or what have you. And then what you would have done, stomped on them, pressed them, and it would have come out here, into this little funnel. Now you can see the remains of said funnel right behind me. This hole here, there was where the juice would have been squeezed out and into a barrel right down here on the ground where I'm sitting. Of course, the Romans did more than just wine. Let's head down the hill to the artisan quarter. Well, would you look at that? When I first got to Tunisia, I was told we were in the middle of a drought. That they'd only had 2 or 3 days of rain, and that was causing a water shortage. It looks like that has ended. Now, from a human perspective, I'm quite glad to see the Tunisian water crisis is at least a little bit eased. But, as somebody who just came from Britain... Oh man, up man. The Romans aren't the only ones making wine, I see. Moving on to another industry. Now this is what the old German archaeology dig is calling the artisan quarter. And that means basically that this is where the craftsmen were. And you can see that. You see this red staining on the walls just behind me. It's a sign that there really was a kiln there. It was oxidizing all the material, turning it red. As you can see now, the theater just off the main street could hold a huge crowd, and this wasn't even the biggest the city had to offer. And you shouldn't take everything at face value either. There's still a lot in Carthage to be discovered. Now this is an interesting one, because this is one that excavators haven't seemed to figure out what it is yet. Their best guess is a school. And you can see where they're coming from. You can see a little courtyard here, nice little rooms, and a couple of neat little mosaics. But that's really interesting to know that even with all the knowledge of Carthage, what we know of the Roman standardized shapes, there's still some things even the experts never figured out. But, of course, there is probably nothing more iconic about Carthage than this. So if you've seen pictures of Carthage, it's probably this section that you've seen the pictures of. And these are called the Antonine Baths, and don't let the name fool you, they're far more than just a bathhouse. They were called the Antonine Baths because they were constructed under the reign of Antoninus Pius in the 2nd century. Bathhouses were also places of public gatherings, places for individuals to discuss business, and places to relax. Social barriers could disappear in bathhouses. It's the largest complex outside of Italy and the 3rd largest in the empire overall. It also contained a massive seaside public pool, a gymnasium, and public toilets. The uses of bathhouses shifted as time went on as well. Now, if some of this stuff looks mined out, you're right. A lot of this stone was taken in the 6th or 7th century by the Muslims in order to build their mosques at Kairouan and Tunis. That's the Grand Mosque of Kairouan behind me. That looks an awful lot like the same stone used in the Antonine Baths in Carthage, doesn't it? Not a coincidence. Now, the baths in all likelihood were probably abandoned in about the 6th century when the Vandals took over. In order to take the city, they had to cut water supply, and therefore the baths could no longer function for their intended purpose. But, honestly, bathhouses were on the way out well before then. Christians were frowning upon the use of public bathhouses. A ton of people bathing together naked doesn't exactly scream Christianity, does it? And Christianity did indeed come to the city. Late Roman and Byzantine scholars ended up bringing a new flair to the city, including the rise of basilicas. Now, the original Roman basilica would not have been a religious function. The original Roman basilica was in fact a public meeting point. It was a safe place for the public to meet and discuss certain things. So as a result, it became a place where Christians could also meet, because they weren't allowed to build their places of worship. But this did change as Christianity became the dominant religion, and with that the use of the basilica shifted, and rather than being secular meeting points, they became places of religious worship and the first churches, hence the rise of the term Romanesque for a church. Now this is a Byzantine basilica. Can you see it? Mosaics down there, mosaic floors. What you get is the twin pillars of the church coming that way, and coming that way right down to that altar at the very end. The Vandals ruled the city for about 100 years before the Eastern Roman Empire, more commonly known as the Byzantines, reconquered the region. As a result, there's a lot of continuity. The Byzantines only ruled the city for another 100 years themselves, however, as the Islamic expansion would swiftly conquer North Africa. As we discussed in an earlier video, the Muslims set up Tunis as a military encampment just outside of Carthage. The center of medieval life under Islamic rule thus shifted westwards towards Tunis, but the city still had a few inhabitants and remained the major port for a few centuries under Islamic rule. It gradually lost importance until finally Cato the Elder got his wish. Now, Carthage was eventually destroyed for good in 1270 by Muhammad al-Muntasir, and for a long time it lay forgotten. Tunis acted as the capital, as did Kairouan. However, when the French began their expeditions in the 1860s, Carthage began a revival, both in the identity of Tunisians and in the memory of modern people. Until finally, in 1985, UNESCO finally said, Carthago servanda est. It became a UNESCO World Heritage Site, allowing the city, all scattered fragmented pieces of it, to be preserved for future generations to enjoy. There's a lot to learn here. It's a city of myth and memory, a city which has evoked poetry and splendor. It is a core of Tunisian identity and a core of world history. And if you're lucky enough to be in the vicinity, take a day or two out of your schedule to wander around the ruins, joining the ghosts of Dido, Hannibal, and all the other historical figures who once called this city home. Anyway, until next time, I'm the Archaeologist. Now go enjoy your own travels.